Hello everyone, I'm Vinoja De Silva, an undergraduate at the General Sir John Kothalavala Defence University. The moment we hear Pearl Harbor, we are immediately reminded of the surprise aerial attack directed by the Japanese forces upon the US naval base in the islands of Hawaii, in which, immediately after, then President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared war against Japan, making US's official entrance into the Second World War. Joining with us today is Mr. Chanika Sinanayaka, who is urged to reveal many of the interesting facts in relation to the 1941 Pearl Harbor attack.
Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. That is how they fired the message to White House when Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese on the 7th of December 1941. Carefully in his historic 6-minute speech, President Roosevelt made the grim announcement. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Now, this was not entirely unexpected. For the past, during the past 5 years, say from the mid-1930s, Japan has been setting her longing eyes on the Pacific, and they have planted several spies in Hawaii to monitor the movements of the fleet, to take measurements and reconnaissance of the airfields and other installations. So today I will speak not about the attack. The attack is well known and documented by military historians. I shall dwell on the humanitarian aspect of the fighting men as well as the civilians who were acting in utter panic and frantically trying to escape the wrath of the Japanese. It was shortly after 8 a.m. on Sunday, December 7th, just as the preparations were being made for the 8 o'clock raising of the colors, when the Japanese attack against Pearl Harbor began. Warnings of a Japanese offensive had been issued in the preceding weeks and months, but a few expected it to take place in Hawaii. And as I tell, rumors were too fantastic to merit any consideration. There was suspense and there were too many clues that have found their way to the Pearl Harbor intelligence authorities. Some were convincing, some were contradicting. So the advantage of that was grabbed by the Japanese, right? The bombs are pouring down from the skies. Torpedo bombers were there, high-level bombers were there. Also there were some fighters, right? Despite all this was going on, now this is human aspect. Now the attack was proceeding at its full force. In the meanwhile, the men were firing at the planes, mostly unsuccessful shots. And in midst of all this, other men struggled to get the guns and ammunition. At Ford Island, a supply officer took a firm stand. No 30 caliber machine guns without a BUSANA 307 sub-requisition. That is, the supply officer, while there is an ongoing attack, which he can very well see from his post, is refusing to release ammunition and guns without the requisition. So that is sheer madness. He was a stickler to rules. Even despite this onslaught, he is sticking to the rules, and see what the men did. On helm, a gunner's mate asked Commander Carroll permission to get the keys to open the magazine lock. The skipper said, "Damn the locks, cut the locks." On the New Orleans, they used fire axes to smash open ammunition-ready boxes. The Pennsylvania, locks were knocked off by gunner's mate who walked around swinging a big hammer. Right? There was no time to sort of find the keys and to open the armories and the magazines. So they had to resort to some effective action also very quickly. So they used to blast the padlocks and the doors with sledgehammers and guns. Now about this all-important radar. The Opana station was one of the 5 mobile units set up at strategic points around the perimeter of Oahu. They were all linked to an information center at Fort Shafter, which kept track of plots picked by the stations. And it was very casual at Opana, another station. This was the most remote of the 5 stations, and 6 men who ran it were left pretty much to themselves. They had a small camp at Hawaiiloa, 9 miles from the coast, and commuted to work by pickup truck. They meant to work in 3-man shifts, but this Sunday they decided that a 2-man shift would do. Lockhart one served as operator and the other both as plotter and motorman. The regular motorman stayed in the sack. But now, this is how this lack of interpretation of radar worked favoring the Japanese invaders. But this Sunday there was little action, few contacts, nobody to evaluate the planes that were spotted, no control officer to direct any interception. They were simply operators and they were not officers. Except for the enlisted men at the plotting table, only the pursuit officer, Lieutenant Tyler, was on hand. But with nobody to give him orders and no planes to relay orders to, he had nothing to do. Nor did he really know what he was meant to do. He had only drawn his duty once before. Actually, he was there purely for training. Now these people were undergoing radar training, and if something highly unusual appears, they treated as an error in the screen. That is how they could not decipher the big cluster of Japanese that was approaching. At 7:02 a.m., Elliot sat down and began fiddling with the controls. Lockhart leaned over his shoulder and started explaining the various echoes and blips. Suddenly, a blip flashed on the screen, far bigger than anything Lockhart had ever seen before. Now, the Japanese invasion forces, slowly approaching their target. It was almost as big as the main pulse the unit always sent out. So big, he thought the set was broken, that somehow the main pulse and the mileage scale had gotten out of kilter. It was a pinball machine gone haywire, right? They were suspicious about the machine. They felt that the machine has gone out of order. Now the Japanese tactics were daring. They were daring and bold. And this is how one American viewed the Japanese tactics. But at the substation headquarters a few yards away, Chief Tope Donman's mate, Peter Chang, in charge of the Navy Submarine Torpedo School, could only watch with sickened admiration as the Japanese plane grooved one strike after another down the narrow alley of the southeast lock. It was a real demonstration for the reluctant students who had to watch it, and Chang didn't hesitate to draw on it for material to be used in future lectures. Now about the action of the families of the servicemen. The Navy families on Ford Island had no time to watch and wave. The war surged all around them, some huddled in the strong concrete bachelor quarters. Others brought cokes and cigarettes for the men swimming ashore. Chief Albert Malter turned his home into a first aid station. He had about 40 there, all soaking wet, all covered with oil, most suffering from shock. Some burned very badly. He borrowed a first aid kit from the big crate the Boy Scout used as the clubhouse. He broke open canned food and juice he was keeping in case of emergency. He raided the linen closet for sheets, towels, blankets. He gave away all his civilian clothes he didn't expect to wear soon again now. Now the serviceman has to go to war. So he is giving away all his items to the needy people. Needy people mean the servicemen who have swum after their ships were sunk. Now let us get into some military affairs. Although the attack was termed a success, there was a flip side also. Now see what happened to the Japanese. The fatal flaw was that the stroke had missed the US carriers. Not a single carrier was berthed at Pearl Harbor during the weekend. They normally do, but this weekend they were away. The stroke had missed the US carriers, its prime target, and had also missed the oil tanks and the other important installations, that is the machine shops which repair the ships. Important installations whose destruction would have made the American recovery much slower. As the Pearl Harbor was the only full fleet base, coming as a surprise, apparently before any declaration of war. It aroused much indignation in America as to unite public opinion behind President Roosevelt and in violent anger against Japan. Now this Japan has attacked without a declaration of war. What happened was all people got rallied round against President Roosevelt and they eventually spelled doom for Japan. The attack on Pearl Harbor must be regarded as a short-term operational masterpiece, but whether it was a long-range mistake will be debated as long as naval history is written. With minuscule losses, Japan inflicted tremendous damage on the US Pacific Fleet. So that was a short-term operational masterpiece, but in the long range, they roused up the Americans who saw to it that Japanese were decimated. As a short-term masterpiece, Pearl Harbor attack is outstanding. For a short period only. The carriers were intact, the oil installations were not bombed, and the machine shops were not damaged at all. So all these three contributed to the revival and repair of the US Navy within a short time. Had the oil installation been blown up, machine shops devastated, and the carriers bombed, it might take about 1 year or more for the US to react. And Pearl Harbor remains an imperative lesson in war, even in an age of nuclear power. The tactics of war would not change from era to era. The principles are the same. Now see what this means. The Pearl Harbor remains an imperative lesson in war, even in an age of nuclear power. Its lesson is one of the history's bitter truths that the unexpected can happen and often does.